speakers, plus some cards to read in. Greg Schmid with Don't Touch My Term Limits, Michigan. He opposes the resolutions. Greg, thank you, welcome. I'm going to have to ask you to keep your comments to about 5 minutes.
I will, thank you.
Thank you. Is the button pushed there?
Yes.
Okay.
How about that? Thank you for letting me come and speak my piece today. I've driven a fair ways to do so. I'm not a lobbyist. I'm not in the legislature. Not a political insider. I'm just a citizen. My remarks today may seem critical, but I want you to know I'm a big fan of Michigan government and of the Michigan's legislature and each of you personally. But the term limits reform proposal is a bad idea. Don't touch term limits. I recognize that you technically have the legal ability to try to weaken term limits by a ballot question. And you could squander $10 million of taxpayers' money to run a special off-cycle election, maybe designed to dampen voter turnout, just like you did in the ill-fated sales tax hike proposal in your last lame duck session. But if you do, you will find out what most people outside the bubble of Lansing already know. The people love term limits as is. They will soundly reject a scheme, and you will squander your personal credibility, the credibility of your party, and this institution in the bargain. They will see right through any attempt to distract attention to the true purpose of a term limits proposal by dressing it up as ethics legislation or reform or session limitations. But a legislative referral to change term limits during the lame duck session is just politically untenable. A legislative referral for term limits reform would properly be seen by the public as self-serving partisan power play designed to protect the current Republican majority in both houses against resurgence of Democrats in 2018 or beyond. If such a measure were passed, it would likely work to freeze Democrats out of a legislative majority for another redistricting cycle. It's naive to think Democrat partisans should participate in their own political sabotage, and so it's unlikely that Republicans could muster two-thirds majority needed for a legislative referral. The term limits on the tenure for legislators were originally established by constitutional initiative. Term limits was placed on the ballot by citizens who collected the signatures of hundreds of thousands of Michigan voters, not by a legislative referral of about 100 people. Because of the nature of term limits and how they came to be imposed upon you, any effort to repeal or change term limits should also come from the people by initiative petition and not by legislative referral on a two-thirds vote of the very legislators who were intended to be controlled by term limits. Michigan voters imposed lifetime term limits on tenure in the Michigan legislature, and since then it's performed as promised to help counteract the corrosive effects of power. Term limits movement was properly seen as a nonpartisan and principled way to counter seniority clout and the awesome advantage of incumbency. Without term limits, re-election campaigns would be uncompetitive, with incumbents enjoying a 97% re-election rate in pre-term limits days. Talented candidates would not even challenge a sitting lawmaker, and so the voters would lack the options at the ballot box that makes democratic choice real. Each of you, current legislators, owes your first opportunity to run in an open and competitive seat to term limits, and without term limits, that might as well have been a lifetime appointment. So each lawmaker who votes to weaken term limits on themselves will face several uncomfortable questions by their constituents. The most obvious dilemma is a conflict of interest inherent in eliminating term limits on yourselves. You will never convince constituents that there's nothing in this for you, even if you exempt yourselves, because it will look like a way of protecting your party power base. But each of you who votes to change limits will also need to argue the false premise that in the days before term limits, career legislators had years of on-job training and developed institutional experience that made them wiser and more competent than you current legislators are today. By arguing that today's legislators, you lack the wisdom, knowledge, and experience to properly govern, undermines your own credibility as elected officials and makes you appear incompetent. Constituents will wonder how you dared to ask for their votes in your first campaign when you were, in fact, not properly prepared to do the job on day one. So term limits never promised to be a panacea for all the flaws in human nature. Term limits did not magically make legislators into innocents with no self-serving motives. Term limits did not eliminate ambition and the lust to get and keep power. Term limits does not automatically make legislators wiser, only less subject to the corrupting influences that drive irrational decision-making. So many people think career politicians...
Greg, I've got to ask you to wrap it up here quickly.
Yep. 1 minute. Many people think career politicians are corrupt, incompetent, unprincipled, cynical, out of touch, captured by staff and special interests, or simply don't care what the electorate wants. But don't prove their point by trying to destroy term limits for short-sighted partisan gains. Term limits impose on you to control the problems inherent in delegated powers. So we don't expect you as legislators to like term limits, only to live with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just real quickly, I do want to point out that